He was the most sadistic serial killer in the history of Romania. He first attacked in 1970, and his crimes shook the Romanian capital. For over a year, he was walking through the dark streets of Bucharest at night, looking for his victims. He chose lonely, attractive women. He attacked with a hammer, an axe, a metal rod, or a knife, always during bad weather. He mutilated his victims and brutally raped them. And through family media, he was considered the most sadistic serial killer in the history of Romania. When his agents, terrified, discovered that the psychopath was sucking the blood of the still-alive victims, they gave him a threatening nickname, Vampire of Bucharest. There were attacks, robberies, and rapes on a daily basis. Fear, despair, and hunger of the inhabitants of the Romanian capital often led to murders. When Elena Udrea was murdered in her own bed, the crime scene was visited by Commissioner Constantin Turaj. He immediately realized that he had never dealt with such a sadistic murderer. The woman died from several blows to the head with a blunt tool. After her death, she was brutally raped. Numerous traces of bites were discovered on her body, and there was a missing piece of skin in the vicinity of the genitals. It was only the beginning of the macabre series of murders of young women that scared Turaj. Between June and November 1944, in similar circumstances, 4 other women were murdered. The murderer killed only blondes, always during bad weather, mainly during pouring rain. Maria, Elena, Rosalia, and Maria died from blows to the head. At the time of her death or just after her, the victims were raped and mutilated. The fingerprint of the murderer, the same one secured in 3 places of the crime, did not help in identifying the perpetrator. The psychopath remained untraceable, and the case was forgotten. The coming end of the war meant that solving the criminal mystery was not a priority for anyone. It was very cold and rainy. Elena Opera, a young blonde who had just finished her afternoon shift in a nearby factory, it was less than 100 meters from the block where she lived. However, this distance turned out to be too large for Elena to safely enter the cage. The next day, just after sunrise, a woman's corpse found a random passage. Militiamen arrived, secured the crime scene, and Inspector Trajan Tandin made preliminary examinations, which he described in detail in his book in 2002.
Elena Opera was attacked by an axe, then bitten and brutally murdered with several blows to the head. The examinations revealed that we were dealing with a man with a very sick mind. The killer bit the victim and sucked blood out of her. There was no rape. Someone probably frightened him.
The massacred body lay in the bushes just before entering the building. Although the place was lit up, no one saw or heard anything. This did not surprise the militiamen. In the then communist Romania, the witnesses of the crimes rarely decided to share their knowledge with the militiamen, rejoicing in their bad reputation. If Inspector Tandin sensed that the psychopath would hit again, he was not mistaken. The next attack took place less than 2 months later, during a rainy night from June 1st to 2nd. The psychopath attacked in the vicinity of the local cemetery. Florica Marcu was thrown to the ground and beaten. The assaulter dragged the victim to a secluded place, then stabbed her in the stomach and raped her. While trying to suck blood from the victim's wound, the attacker was frightened by the truck driver, who, pretending to be in need, heard women's screams from the depth of the cemetery. Florica survived, but was unable to describe the attacker. The first description of the sadist was made by the militiamen on July 24th, just after the 3rd attack on a lonely woman. Margareta Hanganu was luckier than the previous women. Frightened by a group of men armed with an axe, the murderer only managed to pull out his victim's bag. The woman described the attacker, and Inspector Trajan Tandin made a portrait. He described the most important features of the attacker's appearance in his book.
172 to 175 centimeters. Round head, straight face. Long hair, curly, falling on the neck. Excessive chin, nose with wide nostrils, big ears, black hair, probably dark eyes, hair grown on the body.
A few decades later, Wednesday evening in Bucharest, April 8th, 1970. It was very cold and rainy. Elena Oprah, a young blonde who had just finished her afternoon shift in a nearby factory, it was less than 100 meters from the block where she lived. However, this distance turned out to be too large for Elena to safely enter the cage. The next day, just after sunrise, a woman's corpse found a random passage. Militiamen arrived, secured the crime scene, and Inspector Trajan Tandin made preliminary examinations, which he described in detail in his book in 2002.
Elena Oprah was attacked by an axe, then bitten and brutally murdered with several blows to the head. The examinations revealed that we were dealing with a man with a very sick mind. The killer bit the victim and sucked blood out of her. There was no rape. Someone probably frightened him.
The massacred body lay in the bushes just before entering the building. Although the place was lit up, no one saw or heard anything. This did not surprise the militiamen. In the then communist Romania, the witnesses of the crimes rarely decided to share their knowledge with the militiamen, rejoicing in their bad reputation. If Inspector Tandin sensed that the psychopath would hit again, he was not mistaken. The next attack took place less than 2 months later, during a rainy night from June 1st to 2nd. The psychopath attacked in the vicinity of the local cemetery. Florica Marcu was thrown to the ground and beaten. The assaulter dragged the victim to a secluded place, then stabbed her in the stomach and raped her. While trying to suck blood from the victim's wound, the attacker was frightened by the truck driver, who, pretending to be in need, heard women's screams from the depth of the cemetery. Florica survived, but was unable to describe the attacker. The first description of the sadist was made by the militiamen on July 24th, just after the third attack on a lonely woman. Margareta Hanganu was luckier than the previous women. Frightened by a group of men armed with an axe, the murderer only managed to pull out his victim's bag. The woman described the attacker, and Inspector Trajan Tandin made a portrait. He described the most important features of the attacker's appearance in his book.
We were now looking for a man of medium height, about 172 to 175 centimeters. Round head, straight face, long hair, curly, falling on the neck, excessive chin, nose with wide nostrils, big ears, black hair, probably dark eyes, hair grown on the body.
The murderer's sketch was confirmed by Olga, who was attacked at night from the 22nd to the 23rd of November. Although she survived, she was brutally beaten and raped. The investigation has been going on for 5 months. Due to the lack of any evidence, she was in a dead end. However, the Romanian authorities were convinced that arresting a wanted man was only a matter of time. Not wanting to lead to panic, journalists were forbidden to inform the public about the attack on the streets of Bucharest. People were still to live in the belief that all the serial rapists, murderers and rapists are only an element of the broken capitalist West. In socialist countries of popular democracy, such individuals were not allowed to exist. A brutal attack on another woman, this time on a snowy night from the 15th to the 16th of February 1971. Both she and the next victim, who was beaten and raped 2 days later, survived. They were taken to a hospital in a critical condition, where they were described by the investigators. Their statements were consistent and almost completely consistent with the rapist's description, who began to attack a woman with a greater frequency than before. However, he was still cautious, unbridled, and brutal, and, as it soon turned out, deadly effective. The mysterious night hunter now had 6 attacks on his account, including 1 fatal, and it was not his last word. To tell the truth, he was just getting started. So far, he has often been harassed by random people. So he decided to carefully choose the places of his hunts, so as to effectively avoid random witnesses. 2 weeks later, the attacker returned. This time, no one bothered him anymore.
Fanika Ilie was found wounded on March 5, 1971. She had not lived for several hours. The face of the woman was massacred. Her chest, abdomen, thigh, and ankles were bitten by the attacker. The section of the corpse showed that the rape had already taken place after death. It was also discovered that the investigator had sucked blood from the wounds. At the crime scene, there were no traces that could help in discovering the identity of the murderer. At the turn of the investigation, it was necessary to wait a few more weeks.
Exactly on the anniversary of the first crime, on the night of April 8th to 9th, 1971, another woman was murdered during a heavy downpour. Gorgita Popa, like the previous murdered, died from several blows to the head, dealt with a blunt tool, probably a metal rod. After her death, the murderer gave the woman 48 blows with a knife to the chest. Also this time, there was a fatal rape and bites. The wounds at the crime scene revealed that the killer, in addition to sucking blood, bit the woman a part of the crotch. The missing piece of the body was never found. The total number of attacks increased to 8, including 3 fatal. No evidence, no traces, not a single suspect. They realized that time was running out. The mysterious psychopath was still walking the dark streets of Bucharest in the rain. He felt innocent and confident. Meanwhile, the militiamen were still wandering around Omaca. The Secretary General of the Romanian Communist Party demanded the immediate arrest of the uncultivated murderer of women. When the good news did not come, at the order of the Romanian dictator, a special department of the Criminal Investigation Department of the State Security Department was included in the investigation. The experience of the investigators from the Security Department had much greater possibilities than the militia officials and much larger funds. The case was given a high priority. There was one goal: to catch the perpetrator of the cruel crimes, which have not been recorded in Romania for almost 3 decades. The retired commissioner, who took part in a similar investigation in 1944, wrote in his book, The Mysteries of Fingerprints,
The Romanian authorities were finally forced to admit that a serial murderer and psychopath had been lurking in Bucharest for a year. The information leaked by the Security Department was forwarded to the national press. The citizens of the Romanian capital were terrified.
More than 1,000 additional armed militiamen were delegated to patrol the streets of Bucharest at night. The capital was constantly surrounded by 100 unmarked radio vehicles. It was the largest mobilization of the police in the history of Romania. Within a few days, all men convicted of murder or rape were arrested. In total, more than 2,000 people, but without a result.
The investigation was given the nickname Operation Eagle. The modus operandi of the prosecutor was also developed, which was given the nickname Vampire from Bucharest, due to the apparent love for sucking blood of victims. It was noticed that the murderer attacks young women only at night. The attacks are always accompanied by bad weather conditions: heavy rain, heavy snowfall, or thick fog. The victims are tracked and, inconvenient for the prosecutor, attacked by a several-time blow to the head with a blunt tool: hammer, axe, or iron rod. During the murder, or just after it, there is always a rape. And when the murderer has time, after his crime, he gives himself up to acts of cannibalism, biting and probably devouring pieces of the bodies of his victims. It was also noticed that all murdered were blondes. The women who managed to survive are brunettes. Was it just a coincidence? Or maybe a sophisticated plan, born in the sick mind of a monster? The question remained open.
It was assumed that soon the murderer would hit again, Women were warned not to go out alone in the dark. Men took their wives and daughters to work and then home. After the rumor appeared in the media that the murderer attacks only blondes, hundreds of women decided to dye their hair. Despite many security measures, on the first days of May, a vampire from Bucharest hit again.
And several times. First, on the night from May 1st to 2nd, as usual during the rain, Stana Sarachin was attacked. She survived, although she was brutally raped. 3 days later, Michaela Ursu, of course, a blonde, died. During the attempt of a post-mortem rape, the murderer was frightened by the passers-by. Unconcerned, 2 hours later, he attacked Maria Jordash. Fortunately, it ended only on a slap, during which an iron rod fell out of the attacker's hand. The loud sound of metal falling on a concrete sidewalk made the man panic and run away.
During the examination of the bodies, the agents made a breakthrough discovery. Under the body of the murdered woman, Inspector Trajan Tandin found important evidence: a soaked document being a medical release.
Although due to the smeared ink, it was not possible to read the name of the patient, other data was readable. The document was exhibited for the student of the Department of Veterinary Medicine in Bucharest.
2 days later, there were 3 more attempts of murder. The women survived. Meanwhile, the investigators, based on the found medical release, tried to identify the vampire. Although it was not possible to read the student's name, the medical seal was easily identified. The document was exhibited by Dr. Octavian. The investigators confiscated the entire medical documentation in order to identify the names of all suspected students. Detailed research of the medical archive took 2 weeks and brought the desired results. It turned out that the doctor wrote a similar release to 83 students in total. Until May 26, 1971, 15 students did not submit the required document to the Secretariat of the university. It became clear to the agents that one of these students had to be a vampire from Bucharest.
Early in the morning of May 27, 1971, Inspector Trajan Tandin and a group of armed militiamen appeared in the academy. All 14 men who were at the scene of the medical release were immediately arrested. It turned out that they all had this document with them. The last man from the list of suspects was then absent in the academy, 25-year-old Rimaru. Inspector Tandin felt that he was one step away from catching the wanted psychopath.
Before entering the academy, the man at the moment of arrest had a sports bag with him. When the militiamen surrounded the student, he tried to attack the law enforcement officers with a kitchen knife taken from the bag. In addition to the knife, he had a small axe with him. However, he was deprived and beaten. Transported to the Rimaru police station, he shouted,
"I beg you, forgive me for everything I have done. Please forgive me."
Recalling the moment of arrest in his book, the inspector wrote,
"There was a relief in the capital. The long-awaited moment has come. The killer has been caught."
When the militiamen searched the academy room where Rimaru lived, they found the tools of the crime with traces of dried blood in the backpack under his ear, an axe and a metal rod. There were no more doubts. The vampire from Bucharest did not harm any woman. The investigators had to answer 2 more key questions. Who was Ion, and what made the poor student of veterinary become an irrelevant psychopath? He was born on October 12, 1946, in the town of Korobia, on the Romanian-Bulgarian border. The boy's childhood was not happy. His father, Floria, the driver of a night bus, often beat his 3 sons. The oldest of them, Ion, suffered the most. His mother, Ekaterina, did not defend the children. She was also a victim. When Floria got tired of torturing his wife and children, he left the family home and went to Bucharest, where he came from. After the separation, the Romanians still kept in touch with each other, and Ion, after starting his studies at high school, joined his father. Although he lived in a boarding school, he met his father often. Shortly after arriving in the capital, Ion began to have problems with the law. Every time he was arrested for theft or embezzlement, Floria reached out a helping hand to his son. He paid bail and picked up his son from the arrest. Ekaterina blamed her ex-husband Ion's life took a bad turn since my son was taken care of by his father. Ion Rimaru wanted to study. In 1966, he became a student of the Department of Veterinary Medicine of the University of Bucharest. However, he was a weak student, which was often emphasized by his lecturers. He repeated every next year of study, and one of the professors admitted
that he was a very weak student, an even weaker man, a shy and scared half-illiterate with a poor vocabulary. He made the impression that he was not interested in anything.
Rimaru's friends did not have a better opinion of him. The head of the department often complained about his strange behavior. Ion could walk around the room he was self-harming. It also happened that he made his physiological needs at his own bed. Every now and then, he disappeared at night. No one knew where and why. When he came back in the morning, bloodstains on his clothes were found on the floor. He explained to his friends about his participation in night fights. He also pointed out his strange behavior towards his friends. Ion followed the girls he liked, and he could spend the whole night under the doors of the room where they slept. Rimaru was very sensitive. He reacted to any critical comments of his friends or teachers with aggression, which quickly turned into a state of depression and resignation. After his arrest, all the residents of Academica felt an indescribable relief. During interrogation, Ion Rimaru admitted to all crimes and withdrew his explanations. Every day he presented a different version of events. At some point, he accused his father of participating in attacks on women. After these words, Floria's son, who was actively supporting him, suddenly disappeared. The agents could not find him, and although he later recalled his accusations, the investigation showed that Floria not only knew about his son's crimes, but also received items stolen from him. However, the participation in the crimes was not proven. During the trial, all the women who survived pointed to Ion as the perpetrator of the attacks. The evidence in the case was also a tooth extract, which perfectly matched the traces of bites on the victim's body. The testimony of the vampire's mother was also of great importance. The evidence indicating the guilt of the accused turned out to be indisputable. Rimaru then began to pretend to have a mental illness. However, when the interrogation room was full of psychiatrists, they said that he was a reasonable person and could be responsible for his crimes. The murderer remained silent. He did not speak a word until the end of the trial. Looking at the tempo in the wall, he did not even answer the questions of his defendant.
The judges had no doubt. Ion Rimaru was found guilty of all the crimes he was accused of. 14 assaults on women, 4 murders committed with premeditation, 6 attempted murders, 7 rapes committed with special cruelty, 1 rape attempt, and post-mortem dismemberment of the body, and confirmed acts of cannibalism. There could only be one sentence. The vampire from Bucharest was sentenced to death.
A wooden pole, hammered into the ground, in the courtyard of a prison with strict rigor, carried traces of bullets. It was a macabre souvenir after many executions carried out in this place. On Saturday morning, 23rd October 1971, Ion was brought to the pole. Armed, 3-person execution platoon was already waiting in the designated place, ready to face justice for the murderer executed.
In the morning, when the other prisoners were still asleep, Rimaru was taken out of his cell. He was given civilian clothes. He knew that he would be shot in a moment. He didn't want to go to the courtyard. He lay on the floor and was very scared. Let's be honest, he behaved like a coward. He did not agree to the execution in any form. He cried and asked for forgiveness.
Rimaru was forcefully brought to the execution site by the prison guards. He was pulling and pulling. He was shouting that he was innocent. Attached to the pole, he asked for a blindfold. When asked if he wanted to give something to his family or light the last cigarette, he refused. When the executioners loaded the gun, the convict made the last attempt to change his fate.
I beg you, call my father. Let him come here and see what will happen to me. It is he who is guilty, not me. Only he wants to live.
These were the last words of the convict. Just before firing, he instinctively tried to avoid the bullets. He managed to loosen the rope and turn around the pole, turning his back to the cats. The bullets hit him in the neck, cracked his brain, and came out with his forehead. The body of the vampire was put together in a wooden box and buried in a prison cemetery. When it seemed that the story of Rimar had come to an end, life added another chapter to this story. Actually, two. When a few months after the execution, Konstantin Turaj, the commissioner, read the file of his case, the description of the murders seemed very familiar to him. They resembled crimes from 1944, which Turaj unsuccessfully tried to explain. Is it possible that Rimar was imitating a serial killer from 3 decades ago? How did he know about it if the details of those crimes never got to the press? He tried to connect these 2 series of murders. The solution came completely by accident and was a huge surprise for everyone. Almost a year after the execution of Ion, on September 23, 1972, Florea Rimaru died in an accident. The man was followed by agents in connection with his alleged participation in his son's crimes. He was to be arrested by train, which he traveled by. At the sight of the approaching agents, Florea jumped out of the speeding train. As a result of the jump, he hit his head. The fugitive died. The fingerprints of Denat were taken and brought to the national database. The investigators could not believe what they saw. Ion's father turned out to be a serial killer from World War II for 28 years. The investigators were sure that his son had no idea about Florea's crimes. Otherwise, he would have used this fact to save his skin before the execution. 2 generations of Rimaru, 2 serial murderers and evil genes that released the same criminal instinct in the father and son. Did Florea learn to murder Ion? The commissioner in his book was convinced that he did. He combined their method of operation, but more about that another time.